I think that Trump is very often the worthy target of a lot of criticism. However, as a political scientist, do you think that the crisis that we are currently seeing unfolding in the United States is a direct result of the actions and decisions made by the Trump administration? Or is the coronavirus, due to its unprecedented nature, the type of crisis that has the potential to rock any previous administration?
So I think, I mean, when you're a political scientist and you're evaluating the evidence of this stuff, there's a difference between bias and objectivity. Balance is the incorrect thing to pursue. So balance is where you say everybody would have done it the same. That's just empirically not true, right? Objectivity is where you say you criticize, you call, to use an American expression, you call balls and strikes as you do in baseball. And in this one, it's very, very clear that the Trump administration's response has been driven by Donald Trump, and that it has been uh, incredibly different from every other administration's approach, how it would have been throughout history. And I'm talking about Democrats and Republicans. So I mean that in a few key ways. One is that previous presidents have understood the responsibility of pandemic preparedness. So whether it's George W. Bush having a major investment in things like PEPFAR, which is his outreach on malaria, HIV research, et cetera, or Barack Obama setting up the pandemic response plan after the Ebola outbreak, primarily in West Africa, they've really, really taken it seriously. And Trump effectively dismantled a significant part of the federal bureaucracy that was tasked with doing this, which previous presidents wouldn't have done. The second thing, and this is the much more important thing, is there is a built-in apparatus to raise red flags, sort of sound the alarm when there is an early warning that a pandemic could happen. And that happened this time. There was an early warning, and the timeline is contested by the White House, but we know absolutely with certainty that in January, President Trump was aware of the risk of a global pandemic. And what he did in that period was he systematically downplayed the threat while he sidelined those who were telling the truth about it. So there were people in the administration, whether it was from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta or health officials, who were making statements about how this could be very bad. And those people were demoted within the Trump administration, or he made moves to make sure they didn't end up on TV again and do what he worried about much more, which was to alarm investors and therefore hurt the economy. And you have a series of statements that he made throughout crucial weeks in late February into mid March, in which he effectively said this is part of a hoax to score political points against Trump. That was one quote. Another where he said there are 15 cases in the US that will soon be zero. And he highlighted there were no deaths. Of course, now when we're recording this, there's more than 50,000 in the US. So what's different about this is both the actual apparatus of state preparedness and then the words of the president. And both of those things are hugely important anytime a crisis strikes. So I have no problem as somebody who's an objective analyst of empirical evidence in saying that Trump did a much worse job than any previous Democrat or Republican in the modern era would have done in dealing with the coronavirus.
To illustrate my next question, I've been seeing a lot of kind of commentary on the internet and in the media suggesting some concern that the Democratic candidate Joe Biden, he has a lot of gaffes in his speeches. He sometimes goes off script. There's some concern that he may not be able to compete with Trump on the campaign trail. I kind of think this is hilarious because obviously Donald Trump never stays on point. He constantly goes off script, constantly says things that are factually incorrect, and obviously constantly lies. And yet the same rules don't seem to apply to Donald Trump as they do to potentially every other candidate in American politics. However, do you think that the coronavirus is something that he cannot dodge and it has hurt him politically, as something that could have a real effect on his re-election chances next November?
Two parts of that question I'll deal with. The first is about the sort of why is he invincible from political criticism that is levied at other candidates, particularly Democrats? And I think this is a very astute point you make, which is that there's something called novelty bias in political coverage of candidates and politicians. So, for example, Elizabeth Warren pledged not to take money from super PACs initially, and then was hammered for the hypocrisy that she was raising money from some large donors later on in the race, which is fair enough, right? There was some hypocrisy there, but of course that became the headline compared to politicians who were not doing anything to try to limit the influence of big money in politics. And so the reason why that story was big was because it was new. It was like, oh, Elizabeth Warren is not doing what she says she was going to do. Now, Trump does that all the time, but we know that, right? Mm-hmm. So it's novelty bias. Something new becomes attention seeking. That's also happening with Joe Biden, right? So when Joe Biden makes a gaffe, oh my gosh, this career politician is doing something that's not what we expect a career politician to do. That's more interesting to some in the media than person who never does anything the normal way or never stays on message continuing to do that, right? And I think it's a real problem with the way not just our cognitive bias as news consumers, but also as news producers is that pundits have a built-in incentive to say something new, right? I've been saying the same critiques of the Trump administration for years, and in some ways it's a little boring. But that's not because they're different, right? It's just because the same critiques apply, and they are the real problems with the Trump administration. Whereas pundits who say, oh, he's got a new tone this week, well, they get a lot more coverage because they're saying something has changed. So I think that's the first point. The second one about the political fallout is I wrote a piece in early March, which I got a lot of flack for, by the way, and Sean Hannity did a segment on me on Fox News where I said, the coronavirus is going to be Trump's Chernobyl. And what I meant by that is obviously it's not a nuclear meltdown, but rather that the prioritization of political myth-making over the protection of lives is what was driving the response to a crisis, right? And that's what happened in the Soviet Union when the Chernobyl accident. They tried to cover it up. They tried to make sure that it didn't harm the image of the Soviet Union, the same way that I think Trump has been driven by trying to look at coronavirus as a PR exercise. And the problem with both the Chernobyl accident and the coronavirus pandemic is that at the end of the day, people know these things happened, right? You can spin them for a little bit. And this did happen through March, right? I mean, I got a lot of hate mail that said I was making a mountain out of a molehill. This was just the flu. I was, one of the things that people like to say about those who criticize Trump is that I have Trump derangement syndrome. Those things, have stopped because 50,000 Americans have died and 25 plus million Americans are unemployed at the time we're recording this, right? So, and it's going to get worse. I mean, there's about 2,000 to 3,000 deaths a day right now. And so, we're looking at a huge catastrophic death toll, and you can't spin it, right? I mean, you can't just pretend that didn't happen. So I think the fact that Trump's base is going to stick with him, that's very frequently, the question that I get asked a lot when I do media appearances is, well, is this going to affect his base? And the answer is always no. There is literally nothing he could do that will affect his base because his base is with him to the end. And by the way, this was the same for Richard Nixon, who's the only president to leave office through resignation. He had an approval rating of 29% when he left office in disgrace after there were tapes of him orchestrating a break-in and cover-up illegally, right? So 25 to 35% of Americans will always be with Trump no matter what he does. The problem is you can't win an election with 25 to 35%. So what I've long suspected, and there's some empirical evidence to suggest this, but it's not ironclad, is that when you see his poll numbers going, approval rating going between, the low point was around 35% with the Charlottesville comments in August of 2017. He's hit a peak of maybe 46, 47% at times. That juxtaposition, that 11-point movement, those are the people, in my view, that are happy with the economy. And so, one thing that I think is going to be very difficult for him is the loss of people who say, I'm not a huge Trump fan per se, but I am happy with a growing stock market. Everything seems fine, etc. The two problems he has now, and sorry, this is a long-winded answer, but it's a very complicated subject. The two problems he has now are that the economy is cratering and he's not going to be able to solve that before November, and that his firewall of voting support is in older voters who are the most reliable voting demographic in the United States, 65 plus people. And his problem is that his two priorities are now in conflict with each other. Because if he wants to say that the economy is going to grow, fine. But that means he's going to have to sacrifice more old people in his policymaking because he's going to open the economy quicker and then more old people will die. And if he does that, then that exacerbates the problem of the elderly population because they say he's prioritizing the economy over our lives. So he's in a catch-22, which is why I don't see him solving this problem. And right now, if I had to guess, a pandemic opens the floodgates of political possibilities. So this could change dramatically in the coming months. But right now, I think he would lose the election and lose it quite badly. So we'll see what happens in the next 6 months. But he is not in a good position. And even if you were the best, most skilled politician in the world, a historic depression combined with mass death is not something you want when you're heading into re-election, and that's what he's facing.
November is a little way away, but many experts are saying that the so-called hammer and dance of the virus will still be going on come November and come the election. How do you think this will affect the running of that election? Do you think it will open the possibility for things like registering online and vote by mail? And what are the real opportunities and threats of these electoral reforms?
I think that it's clear that there is going to be a risk that's above zero to in-person voting in November. I think that's the starting point, right? That unless we have a miracle vaccine, and even then, there's a lot of problems with the idea of getting it rolled out in time for November. There's still going to be a risk to in-person voting, and so what you want to do in any democratic system is minimize that risk, right? And of course, for vulnerable people, this is another thing. This links back to the previous answer about the elderly. Is vulnerable groups, if there is a perceived risk of going to the polls, might be less likely to turn out. Again, that would be bad news for Trump. So or at least it would have been had the patterns held from before. So the big question is how you mitigate it. And what you don't want to do is what happened in Wisconsin. They had an election a couple weeks ago. There was a debate about whether it should go ahead. The Republicans effectively tried to push back against the idea of having more absentee ballot voting and vote by mail. And people put themselves at risk to go vote. And it was inspiring to see that, but it's obviously not a thing that you should be asking citizens to do, to choose between their health or their right to vote. So vote by mail is the obvious choice. And this doesn't even have to be by mail, right? So one of the things that Minnesota, where I'm from, has had for the last couple election cycles is no excuse early voting, which basically means you don't need to have a reason why you vote before election day. Normally, if you wanted to be an absentee voter, voting by mail or doing something, at a city council office, whatever, you had to say, okay, well, I'm going to be gone. I'm going to be in Italy and on the election day. Therefore, can I do it early? If you do no fault early voting, then you can have people vote safely because it's spread out over the span of 2 weeks, as opposed to a 12-hour period on a Tuesday in November. But also, I think vote by mail just has to be part of the equation, and that can be expanded. There is time to do that logistically, as long as people want it. The problem is that Republicans don't want it, and I think there's several reasons for that. The reason they give the public, which is false, and I think again this is going back to objectivity versus balance. This is a false claim they're making, is that this will cause voter fraud to skyrocket. And one of the things that I'm an expert on is voter fraud and election rigging, and it's not true, right? There are several states in the United States that have vote by mail with no serious discernible change in the rates of fraud, which, by the way, is minuscule anyway. The second thing that they claim is that this will help Democrats because the only states that have vote by mail are Democratic states. Again, this is false. Utah, which is a highly conservative state, one of the most Republican states in the country, has vote by mail exclusively. So it's something where you have a couple false claims being presented to the public. What is the real reason? My guess, again, this is inference, but it's not guaranteed, but this is my read of the situation, is that when you look at the 2020 election from the position of Trump, he understands that he has a ceiling, which is to say he has never been more than, say, 47% popular in the voting averages, the polling averages, I should say. If that's the case, then you need to make sure as few people vote as possible so that your small base actually ends up being a significant chunk of the electorate, right? If the pool is bigger, then your small base that simply isn't growing is going to be a smaller share of the electorate. If the pool is smaller, then your rock solid support from your base will matter more. So, there is a question about trying to do what's called voter suppression, which has been going on for quite a long time. And that, again, objectively, not balanced, the Republicans have been prioritizing as a method to reduce turnout among groups of voters that tend to vote for Democrats. And this is primarily groups of voters like poorer individuals, particularly of an ethnic minority. And the way this actually happens, by the way, and this is where I think it's really important that we have federal election laws that stop this stuff from happening, is that if you are a minority ethnic voter in the United States, the odds of you waiting for more than an hour are 6 times higher than if you're white to vote, right? So it depends. The variation is quite substantial depending on where you are in the country, but there's a clear race bias where what they've done is they've limited the number of precincts in areas that are overwhelmingly full of African Americans, for example, which tend to vote for Democrats. So I think, my attitude towards this has always been very, very simple. You want to make it as easy as possible to vote, to maximize the number of people who can safely vote, particularly in a pandemic. And you want to do it in ways that ensure that voter fraud is still a minuscule problem, which is all the ways that I've been talking about. So there's a clear pathway. It's just a question of whether the political problem can be overcome, and Republicans will follow those principles rather than sort of the partisan, pursuit of power.
These days, a lot of people struggle to navigate the political sphere, and I was wondering if you could just recommend a book or a set of ideas to just help people find their way and help people understand better how to become more politically literate.
I just finished reading today, actually, which I think every social science oriented person should read, is called Behave by Robert Sapolsky. He's not a normal political scientist. He is a biologist who's studied baboons, but is one of the smartest people, I think, that we have on the planet. And he has written a lot about aspects of how human behavior is a complex interplay between social and environmental pressures and biology. And it's a fascinating book that I think does an excellent job of explaining stuff like, why are certain types of people drawn to right-wing authoritarianism, and certain other types of people just simply are not, right? So I think that's a huge question for our time. And I'd really, recommend reading a lot about, Anne Applebaum has some excellent work about historic despotism, is particularly in the Soviet Union. You have people like Timothy Snyder who have written a lot about fascism, which again is a very important topic for us to pay attention to in these, very scary times. There's themes more than books that I would say people should pay attention to. And I think that in a way that the pandemic is going to create a sort of laser-like focus on some things that are really important that we've lost sight of. One is that competence matters in government, right? And I think this used to be a nonpartisan view, and now is unfortunately not. And I think when you have real crises, you start to believe that. I mean, I can't imagine, in the UK context, for example, I can't imagine Michael Gove going on TV today and saying we've had enough of experts, right? I mean, the experts are making the vaccines. They're ensuring that you and your family members don't die, and people are very, very grateful for that. Mm-hmm. So I think that the backlash to populist blowhards will probably be substantial as a result of the pandemic. I also think that there is a very important discourse that needs to be had and will be had, and I think you should be looking out for work on this from smart people who are thinking about these problems. Is how do we have an economy rebuilt after this? What are the things that are structurally wrong with our economy that the pandemic has exposed and made much, much worse? And so I think there's just got to be a question about precariousness in the modern world. How many people were this close to going to a food bank if they lose their job for 3 weeks? You have questions about inequality, which frankly is unsustainable at the levels we have now. You have questions about social safety nets and the appropriate role of the state in preparing for disaster situations and emergencies. And you also have, all of this happening at the same time that there are questions about how automation is going to do massive dislocation to the economy in a way that probably globalization was minor in comparison. People need to think very, very carefully about those questions. They're going to be the questions for the next 10 years, in my opinion. And if we get them right, the one silver lining of this, to end on a note of optimism, is that despite all the tragedy and despite all the uncertainty and anxiety that the pandemic has produced, it is an opportunity in one very important way, which is it gives us a chance to reassess what's important, not just in our own lives, but in the way we structure our societies. And so if we use this to fix problems that have been festering for a long time, but now are in plain sight because people are dying of a disease and, our healthcare systems are strained and people are literally, on their last dollar or their last pound after just a couple weeks without work, that will be, something that could be a legacy of the pandemic we could all be very, very happy with, right? It's not to minimize the tragedy, the death, any of the other things, but it's just to say that given that we now know what we know, we need to solve problems collectively and think about them very, very passionately with a view towards ensuring that we're not just prepared for the next pandemic, but we're also prepared for the next economic downturn. We're prepared for the next natural disaster. And of course, we're prepared for the looming problems associated with climate change. So my hope is that there will be a renewed engagement in politics and an understanding that competence, expertise, facts, science play a role in policymaking and must play a central role going forward.